Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. And I'm saying good afternoon to all of you here in the room, as well as to our folks who are tuning in online. I think we are live streaming this. My name is Melissa Nobles, and I'm the Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences here at MIT. And it is my real pleasure to welcome you to the second of our Community Dialogue series as part of the MIT and Legacy of Slavery project. So just a bit of background for those of you who are perhaps a little bit new to coming to this. The first class of MIT and Slavery undergraduate research project ran last semester in fall 2017. Professor Wilder, one of the panelists here today, and Noah Murphy, MIT archivist for research services at the MIT libraries, and 4 undergraduates began the work of researching MIT's connection to slavery and its legacy. In February of this year, the class's initial findings were presented at a community-wide event. I think it's fair to say, for those of you who were there, that the standout of this initial event were the students' presentations themselves, and really the robust questions and conversations that their presentations engendered. Our panel discussion today marks the beginning of what we expect will be enriching, informative, provocative, searching, and engaging events and activities to promote community exchanges and dialogue in the coming academic year. So this is kind of, in a certain way, a teaser for next academic year. The MIT and Slavery class continues on, attracting new students and keeping some of our intrepid members of the inaugural class. I should also clarify here that the we here is a terrific group of faculty and staff from offices around the Institute that are working along with me, and these folks think a lot about and work tirelessly towards maintaining and improving community life here at MIT. But the motivation for today's panel comes from the questions we receive from members of the MIT community, both here on campus and from alumni. Many of these questions had to do with history and how we should grapple with it. And we thought a great way of getting answers to those questions would be to ask an historian. And lo and behold, we have historians here at MIT. In fact, a terrific group of history faculty, and they're the people who will be guiding us in our thinking today. So I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll get to the questions, because that's what we are really all here for. So our first is Professor Lerna Ekmekçioğlu. She's a historian of modern Middle East with an expertise in Turkish and Armenian history in the 19th and 20th centuries. She also studies ways to better understand conflict, including genocide and coexistence after genocide. Professor Malick Ghachem is a historian of slavery and abolition in the Atlantic world from the 1500s to the 1800s, with a focus on on Haiti and on the Haitian Revolution. Professor Tanalis Padilla is a historian of Latin America, with a focus on political and agrarian movements and social justice in modern Mexico. And Professor Craig Wilder, a historian of American institutions and ideas, and he literally wrote the book on the history of institutions of higher education and their deep engagement with slavery. So just a bit about a process. We provided our historians today some questions, guiding questions to get our conversation going. I'm going to ask one, and they're going to answer it, and then talk amongst themselves, and we'll go through it with a few questions. After that, our intention is to open it up to you all and to get even more dialogue going. So the first question is a pretty basic one, and it's the one that actually animates this panel. What gives us the right to interrogate history or make judgments about people and cultures of earlier times by our contemporary values, laws, and worldviews? So, Malick, what gives us the right to interrogate history?
Well, it's not a right. History is not a professional discipline that you have to be certified in order to engage in the profession in the way that you do to have to practice law or be an engineer or something like that. Anybody can do it. And so it's not a question of right. I think it's also not a question of interrogation so much as it is understanding history. I mean, I think this is true even of historians of slavery. Most of them that I know, and I know a fair amount of them, aren't really interested in judgment first and foremost. I mean, they're really interested in dwelling enough with this story to be able to understand it. And then, at the end of the day, perhaps draw some conclusions that do involve an element of judgment. But I think that's the focus of it. And then I think the last word that's tricky in that question, Melissa, is the word contemporary, because it's not quite so clear to me that there is such a sharp separation between history and the contemporary, which is what is implied in the notion that we today are passing judgment on a past that is separate from us, and that I think is a little problematic. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
Tanalis?
I guess some of my thoughts when I first read this question was sort of the assumption also that there is a way to do history just objectively, as if it's just kind of where you point out the names and dates and facts, and and that's it. The very process of writing history, of investigating, of researching, of analyzing involves thinking about it. And I don't think that we can extricate ourselves from our contemporary surroundings that make us who we are. Again, with the question itself, it sort of assumes, if this is specifically, let's say, about slavery, that there was one way to look at it and understand it in the past, as if there weren't competing debates even back then. So I would say that it's important to analyze history and think about who was contesting those values even back then. And of course, there we have an enormous amount of people, right? Slaves. We also have abolitionists, and even within members of the dominant power structure, you had some debates about it. So I think our task as historians is to analyze those, and I think there is some way to talk about what human values existed back then and to interrogate the way they relate to what particular values we have right now, or we hold right now, or the competing of values that we have right now.
Thank you. Lerna?
Yes. So when there is this chronological separation between, when people bring up this idea of a chronological separation in trying to make sense of the past, I find it very interesting because of what I study and because of who I am. I studied the Armenians who were the survivors of the Armenian Genocide, 1915 Armenian Genocide, who remained in Turkey. And this is a place, I say genocide, but the state itself does not recognize it as such, and it does not, it has never apologized, it hasn't paid any reparations, so it really is truly a dark past that the descendants, including those in Turkey, have to grapple with. So one of the pillars of Turkish state official denialism has been this idea that genocide as a term, as an international crime, did not exist until the early 1940s, and it only became part of international criminal law in 1948 when the UN passed the Genocide Convention. So how can the Turkish official stance would argue, like, how can we attribute this term to something that happened way before the very coining of the term itself? People have written a lot about this, but one of the, I think, the simplest and succinct answers to this question was given by Paul Boosian of New York University. He's a philosopher. And he just simply stated, he wrote a long article, but the summary is that, and it's about the dinosaurs really, like these animals called dinosaurs existed back then while there was no one to name them as such. This is the same kind of analogy. But of course, dinosaur naming is easy because it does not involve an ethical imperative. And when we talk about difficult past, there is a huge aspect of morality. So I found of all these questions, of course, I found this one to be the most challenging, interesting one. I ended up, as I was trying to brainstorm on my own while I was writing, I ended up writing a paper about it. But I am asked not to read it. I will read it at one point in the future, I'm sure. But the highlight for me, the most important part of is that I do teach, in fact, in my classroom, the other version of this question when it is turned into an axiomatic statement, that we should not judge, judge or try to understand the people of the past with our contemporary criteria. Because I teach them not to be ahistorical or anachronistic. Anachronistic meaning misplaced in time or against its time, against its chronos, really. So our job, our mandate is to keep them in context, in time and in space. There are different types of analysis that we can do while keeping either the space constant or the time constant, right? But we should not fall short of, fall into the traps of ahistoricism or anachronism. I give you one example if I have enough time. This will be my longest answer because this is the one that I thought about the most.
You have a paper on it.
Yes. Yeah, if there is enough demand, I'll read it too, despite here. No, because I struggle with this in the classroom too, specifically when I talk about the Ottoman Empire. I teach a course called Minorities and Majorities in the Middle East. And when we cover the pre-19th century Ottoman Empire, when we come to this question of how did the Ottoman Empire manage its ethnically, religiously, religious polyglot empire, like all empires, Ottoman Empire was quite diverse. And so they employed the Islamic law. This is a Muslim empire. The royal family was Muslim. They ruled via Sharia. And according to Sharia, there are certain entitlements, restrictions first, deprivations that non-Muslims have to endure, while they have certain kind of entitlements, for instance, but they are hierarchically organized. So non-Muslims are not allowed to, according to Islam, to be employed in the civil or military bureaucracy. There are these kind of like substantial restrictions, as well as some what we might call cosmetic restrictions. They cannot build houses, like Christians and Jews cannot build houses that are taller than the Muslim houses, for instance, or they cannot ride horses, so that their mobility is restricted. They have to defer at Muslims at all times, quite explicitly. It is like that, and that's okay. So, in exchange for this acceptance of their inferior status, they receive protection of their lives, honor, property, and they do enjoy a certain level of religious freedom. So this is the kind of contract between the Muslim ruler and the non-Muslim subjects of a Muslim rule that we covered a lot. So when students start thinking about this, the first response is they are discriminated against in the Ottoman Empire. And my first job is, it is an anachronistic way of thinking about pre-19th century Ottoman Empire because there was no such thing as equality, and the job of the Ottoman Empire was just a distribution of justice. Mm-hmm. And in the Ottoman mind, you don't have to be same in front of the law for justice to serve its purpose. Mm-hmm. So it's a very explicit system. It's a very honest system, actually, also. The idea is that you could have been a Muslim by choosing to be a Muslim, you, the non-Muslim person, but you chose not to, so you endure these consequences, but because you promised us that you will not help our enemies and you will remain subservient at all times, we'll give you So it is legal differentiation, because religion is criterion enough for this system to differentiate between the subjects. So discrimination assumes illegal differentiation. So I would caution them not to use this term just so that they learn their history and historical thinking. But then there is a moral aspect to this, right? I cannot end this, or actually they will not end the story like that also. They are actually well-conditioned American students. They know that this cannot be it. So therefore I have to overemphasize the other part to make them challenged a bit more. So what we say is that, okay, yes, as a human society, we decided at this point in America here that religion is not, or race is not difference enough for legal differentiation. Therefore, we can call it, by our standards, it is discrimination. So historical inquiry has room for both for intellectual analysis, historical thinking, but also moral interrogation an objection, really.
Thank you.
I agree.
Okay, I can take the next one.
You know, I think history is not a bill of accusations. And so I think when the question, when it first came up, was also attached to the question of sort of making moral judgments about slavery and about the past. And first, as my colleagues have pointed out, I think the separation between past and present is often an artificial one and a convenient one. It tends to be a kind of a barrier that we throw up when we become uncomfortable with certain kinds of historical and political inquiries. But I think it also has certain dangers to it. And so, for example, it pretends that the past, that people living in the past, right, that period we're looking at, are morally less complicated than we are. That people in the past didn't understand that slavery was wrong. Well, there's no statement that could be more wrong than that. They actually fully understood that slavery was wrong. Slavery was controversial from its very beginning. There's pro-slavery thought in the 18th and 19th century precisely because there's a moral attack on slavery across the Atlantic world. In Massachusetts, that history begins really early and with some sort of, probably unexpected figures like Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister, who by the 1690s had established a society, a religious fellowship among black people in Boston for the purpose of both evangelizing them, but also, as he will later write, for establishing the evidence of their humanity and their equality before God. He actually proposes as a test. Now, Mather is also a slave owner, and his father is a slave owner. And so the historical question is, how could he actually recognize the moral complexity and the moral difficulty of owning human beings and simultaneously own human beings? What the historian is investigating is, in fact, that sort of that complex reality. And you can move from Mather. By 1700, Samuel Sewall has published The Selling of Joseph, an extraordinary tract here in Boston in which he comes to the defense of a black man who claimed that he was free and takes up his case. There's a long history of that kind of activism within Boston and Massachusetts. By 1765, or from 1765 to the end of the American Revolution, probably almost a dozen, certainly 10, legal cases are brought in the Massachusetts courts, both local and colony-wide, statewide, defending different or attacking different aspects of slaveholding and slavery. And in fact, actually, that's how slavery largely ends in Massachusetts, with the two famous cases, Elizabeth Freeman's case, in which a local court in Western Massachusetts actually grants her freedom, basically arguing that her enslavement is contrary to the 1780 Constitution. They extend the constitutional rights to slaves. And then the state Supreme Court upholds that decision in the Quock Walker case on this side of the state. And there you have, in fact, basically effectively the end of slaveholding, because you've now granted enslaved people rights that are inconsistent with slavery, and the person claiming him as a slave is charged with battery for a physical assault upon him, right? So there is no moment in the history of slavery when people don't understand slavery is wrong. And I should also point out, the slaves knew it was wrong. And they're people.
That's important.
Yeah, and they're people, right? So there's in fact a long record of us knowing the problem of slavery. And so the other thing that I get worried about when we go down this sort of line is not only are we throwing up barriers to historical investigations that we find uncomfortable, but also we end up doing damage to things that we want to protect, oddly enough. And so, for instance, the history of abolitionism gets lost when we actually make the claim or we make the statement, what gives us the right to investigate difficult moments in the past? First, these are not contemporary moral values. In fact, a lot of them are actually shared by people in that time period. Morality is not, in fact, this sort of staggered thing. It's evolutionary. But you also end up losing, I think, for example, if you just use Massachusetts, you would end up sacrificing an extraordinarily rich history of people raising up their voices, both the enslaved and the free, in opposition to human slavery, which is critical to the story of Atlantic slavery and critical to the story of United States history.
Does anyone want to, after hearing all that's been said, anything before I move on to the next question? No? You can come back to it. Okay. but there's a certain segue here. So the second question was thinking about your own research. What benefits have other communities drawn from an engagement with difficult histories? So, Lerna, for example, your work deals exactly with that. But I wonder, for all of you, what lessons, what benefits have people drawn from actually taking this seriously? So we've established that we can do it, right? That it's our responsibility to do it, if not a right. It's our responsibility, in part because we're trying to better understand ourselves. So what have communities learned? Can I go to you first, Lerna?
Yeah. In the literature on genocides, at least, of course, the ideal case is Germany and its relationship to its own very difficult past, Holocaust. They, as we all know, they recognize the reparation system is great. Still, people are both symbolically and substantially receiving attention, meaning the survivors or the descendants of the survivors. Most other very difficult pasts or violent pasts specifically have not been atoned, rectified, or even faced with. So there are very few examples of, specifically I'm talking about genocide that reached to its ideal form. What I have in mind is this idea of not genocide, but I really do think that one of the good examples is the United States, specifically in terms of affirmative action, for instance, which really does recognize the existence. Okay, it is maybe not, I don't know this history very well, so I would love to hear more from Craig, but this idea of being history conscious, it assumes, to my mind, affirmative action assumes that there is a link between, it assumes the relevance of the past for the present, and then there are certain groups that need to be supported a bit more than the others in some aspects of their lives is, I think, a way of dealing with a difficult past. Maybe it's not explicitly stated as such. So when you look at it from the perspective of minorities in Turkey, for instance, this is a very ideal way of, it's not apology, it's not, I don't know if it's considered reparation at all, but it is a way of acknowledgement that something needs to be fixed, which is in and of itself so important, which assumes that something went wrong, and now we got it. This time we'll do the right thing. It doesn't matter that it doesn't matter that there's no racism in America or that people are not discriminated against, but I think, or in comparison, it's a good place. The fact that we have it here, like this kind of conversations are happening at MIT, or they started happening maybe 15 years ago, starting with Brown, specifically in terms of institutions of higher education. And then schools, yes, to a certain extent in normative American history, there is not enough attention, of course, to the violence of the past, but still it is there, and you can talk about different versions of it.
Right, so in comparison to a place like Turkey, which denies the history.
Yes, yeah, in Turkey,
yeah,
totally, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
Yeah.
Yes. Malick?
I guess I would, reparations, I think you can think about reparations as a kind of benefit, I guess, that comes from studying history. It's a material benefit, but I think some of the predicates of it are a little bit more intangible. So when I think about the benefits of studying history, I think mostly on a kind of spiritual level. For me, the benefits of history are about respect, about humility. So to take the example of Haiti, which is the country that I spend most of my time studying, for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, I think people looked upon the history of Haiti as a country that was sort of inherently underdeveloped through sort of its own cultural faults, most notably the religion of Vodou. And you can actually see traces of this way of thinking still around these days, but it's sort of gone by the wayside. And it hasn't gone away, by accident. It's gone away because, 2 or 3 generations of historians have shown how important slavery was to the whole development of the Haitian nation from the 17th century all the way up into to the present. And so, when you appreciate that in a real way, in a kind of deep way, I think it becomes much harder to engage in sort of facile analyses of the conditions of other countries, and that brings with it a kind of humility and also, I think, respect for what people in a country like Haiti have been able to achieve, notwithstanding those conditions. And then for Haitians themselves, I would say that an event like the Haitian Revolution can bring with it a kind of optimism. So again, speaking of benefits on a kind of spiritual level here, if I were to use that term a little loosely, the Haitian Revolution shows that notwithstanding the legacies of slavery in a country like Haiti, it is possible to counteract, to contain it, to limit the effects of slavery, and in a country like Haiti, that can bring with it a kind of hope in an environment that doesn't have a lot of reasons to feel optimistic about its current status.
Yeah, so I study popular movements in 20th century Mexico, specifically agrarian movements, student movements, teacher movements. And I study them for a time period which for the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, a little bit to the 70s, a time period that was for a long time considered one of political stability and great prosperity, because the Mexican economy was growing at an unprecedented rate of something like 6% a year. So if you were to just take it that way, without interrogating it historically a little bit more, it would seem like it was, a great time for Mexico. And yet, as historians started to look at the history of Mexico from the bottom up, you actually find a great history of popular mobilizations and of protests against this economic model, partly because it wasn't actually serving the interests of the entire population. The benefits of that growth were accruing into ever increasingly smaller hands. So it provides us with a different vision and understanding of what was going on during that time period. You also see that this period was marked by a lot of repression against the movements that were trying to object to the specific policies, many of which were undermining certain rights and benefits that the population had, specifically as a result of a revolution that took place in the earlier part of the 20th century. For social movements specifically, and especially for movements today in Mexico that are still contesting, that are actively trying to figure out and navigate and argue for a different project than the one that exists today, and the one that exists today was constructed specifically on those injustices that previous movements were fighting against. I think social movements today understand, first of all, by looking at that history, that how we got where we are, and I'm speaking about Mexico specifically, though its relationship economically especially is intimately tied to the United States, that how we got where we are is no accident. It was the deliberate policy of rulers and of an elite that were contested at every measure. It also, looking at past movements of resistance, helps current people think of different strategies, of ways of resisting, and of alternative visions of what something might look like today. So I would argue that understanding that the current injustices are created historically is a first step, and understanding that there has always been a legacy of resistance to that injustice gives current people really genuinely hoping to construct a different project and a better world a basis on which to argue for it.
Craig, what are the benefits of thinking about it? Understanding history.
Well, I don't know. I think there are these incredible moments that you recognize as a historian, and in African American history, there are these really great moments that you end up learning about that leave an impression on you, even if you don't end up studying them fully. Right? In the 19th century, there's this extraordinary moment when Black people living largely in the Northeast, in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, free Black communities, begin actually studying the histories of other people. They had actually been studying their own histories for some time, and in part because they wanted to locate themselves in the Atlantic world and in this rapidly transforming world, right? But they also begin, by the 1830s, 1840s, studying the history of Ireland. And you have this incredible campaign launched from the northeastern part of the United States, these small, fairly unstable and insecure free black communities, to get Daniel O'Connell, the Irish revolutionary, to write a statement to black people living in the Americas, to make some formal acknowledgement of them. And O'Connell had formed a close relationship to Frederick Douglass when Douglass was in England and Ireland, both campaigning against slavery and raising money for the anti-slavery cause. And he eventually sends that message, right? 100 years later, African Americans, including people like W.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century, are launching a similar campaign to actually reach out to Mahatma Gandhi. And they're studying, in fact, the independence movement within India and looking to it as a model for their own emancipation. Right? And the reason I bring those two things up is that as sort of group moments in history, as community moments in history in which people are actually using history, but not just their own history, turning to the histories of other people to understand themselves and their struggles, to understand where they fit in the world and where they can find, in fact, both models for their own emancipation, but also the kind of human sympathy that you get from recognizing that you're not alone in the world. And anytime I look at those moments, I actually remember that, in fact, the greatest benefit of history for me has been that. Right? That for me, I think the real joy of history is that it helped me to discover my own humanity. It helped me to recognize, in fact, that my own experience wasn't the only experience that mattered in the world. It helped me to expand my sense of sympathy for the people around me, and a sense of belonging into communities of people that were bigger than the ones that I was immediately born into, but where I was inherently connected by both experience and by interest and by optimism and by hope. And so for me, really, the great benefit of history is the thing that I see every time I go into an archive or a library, or most of the times I go in, is the families who are sitting there doing genealogies, right? And making connections to a personal past, but also in doing that, in fact, discovering something about themselves and how they relate to a much larger world. And so it's precisely that I can look across the table, or I can look across our department and see colleagues who study really quite difficult moments in the past, and not for a moment think that those investigations are anyhow or any way different from or separate from the kind of work that I do.
That's one reason why historians are such humanists, in a way, right? A better understanding our shared humanity and seeing mirrors, right? Which is what we want. I mean, on one hand, we want to appreciate differences, but we also want to embrace our shared humanity. I know a big question that's come up, and I'm sure many in the room are thinking about it, is, and it's not an antagonistic question, but it is a real one, which is, how does a deeper understanding of history, including these difficult histories, help us think about improving conditions in the present day? So everyone wants, as much as you all said, we have to take the past as it is and understand it on its own terms. We want to understand, and you all said a bit about the lessons of what the past can teach us, but what are the ways in which we can use it to build a better future, or help us understand our present, so that we see the connections in robust ways? I think there were some examples that were a part of the previous set, but if you could think about some examples where we can give us something to go on as we think about MIT and its legacy. Malick?
I'll jump in on that one, yeah.
Sure.
So I teach a course on race and criminal justice and citizenship at MIT, and it's basically a course about mass incarceration. And I think one of the things that we have gotten out of a deeper, more profound history of mass incarceration is better law, actually. We have, you can see this about 30 years ago, before the term mass incarceration was on the radar screen. at the beginnings, really, of the phenomenon that we think of as mass incarceration. There was very little self-awareness of kind of the outlandish size of our criminal justice system, particularly in comparison to our so-called peer societies in the North Atlantic world. And I think it was really only because of, again, a couple of generations of scholarship, of people who wrote about how our criminal justice system came to be the way that it is, the racial embeddedness of it, and just the size of it compared to most other societies, that we came around to beginning to reform our criminal justice systems, first at the federal level and now at the state levels. And I think, as an historian, I have to confess that this is something I didn't quite appreciate, or at least I think I saw this problem too narrowly through the lens of an historian who was kind of interested in identifying original scholarship. And I saw these books about mass incarceration, one after the other, and so what is original about some of these books? But it turns out that it was the repetition of this theme that turned out to really turn the tide, I think. And I think we're seeing that play out today. So that, for me, is a really concrete example of how historical inquiry, and it was by historians, by legal scholars, by sociologists, by people in different disciplines, but including history, really kind of transformed how we saw a fundamental aspect of our contemporary society from a very different angle that just didn't appear as visible until you started looking at it in a certain way.
Who wants to go next? Tanalis?
Yeah, I guess I can talk a little bit about the case of Mexico and maybe use one or two examples. So specifically, the book I'm writing right now is on the schools for rural teachers, and these schools that train teachers. And these schools are a legacy of what I already mentioned, the revolution that took place in the first half of the 20th century. And this was a major social agrarian upheaval that overturned a 30-year-long dictatorship. It had very oppressive economic and political policies. And as a result of this revolution and the new constitution, populations that were excluded before gained what we would consider basic rights, among those the right to attend school. And not just the right to attend school, but the state's obligation to create schools and to create schools that would also train teachers that could then go and teach people to read and write. And because of the various radical strands within the revolution and people who fought for it and people who fought for principles of justice, a lot of these schools, the rural teaching schools that I'm talking about, really preserve this idea of justice and certain rights, and the fact that and these schools were explicitly for sons and daughters of poor people, of poor rural people. And so throughout the decades, when subsequent governments tried to limit these schools, close some of them, reduce the funding, the students from them, youngsters, some would start as young as 12 and some be as old as 19, continued to fight to preserve them, or would join agrarian communities in their own struggles and say, well, the right to education is tied with the right to land. And so throughout the decades, you see in Mexico in the 20th century, teachers that continue to be social activists, that go to various communities and use education in the truest sense of the word, of sort of saying that creating consciousness and stimulating communities to engage with what are their rights. These students have always been conscious of where these schools came from, and the government has not liked the fact that they have these radical tendencies. So through different, aside from underfunding them and maligning them in the press, at various times the government has closed some of them. So for example, in 1969, there were 29 and the government closed 14 of them. Today, you still have 17 because also students mobilized to create new ones. And those schools, the fact that they still exist, the fact that their students learn in them not only certain skills, but also ideas of justice and ideas of improving the world and ideas of being social leaders, is very much thanks to the fact that they know the history of those schools. And just very, very briefly, to mention just, for example, another broad example is the history of indigenous peoples in Latin America in general and in Mexico in particular. Right? Indigenous peoples have been suffering have obviously suffered long centuries of discrimination, of genocide, of all that. And the fact that they have continued to resist, the fact that they have continued to preserve their history and their traditions has made it so that government after government in Latin America has been forced to recognize their rights and negotiate with them. This wouldn't be viable if they hadn't resisted, and they wouldn't. This resistance wouldn't have been so strong without knowing and being conscious of that history.
Mm-hmm.
I can go now, sure, because it's related. The same with the Armenian case. I mean, if you think about Armenians as the indigenous people of this land and the Turkish state as one of those Latin American countries, yes, production of historical knowledge by professional historians, but also as like amateurs on the ground, in and of itself is an actor in this fight for, in this specific case, Turkish-Armenian case, for recognition and reparations. So there has been, in this last 15 years, because of various historical and political reasons, we experienced in this particular field almost a boom in studying the genocide itself, not necessarily its aftermath, but also in Turkey, again, because of its own particular political reasons, we experienced in Turkish historiography a more attention on non-Turkish, non-Muslim groups, or even like Muslim non-Turkish groups, such as the Arabs in Turkey, or Jews in Turkey, Greeks of Turkey, that has led to a new kind of thinking about who we are amongst certain groups within Turkey. So because the past and the present, assumption is that the past and the present influence each other, right? And illuminate each other. And people at different points use the past. The creation of past, especially about these already inherently political subjects, politicized subjects, let's say, is a political act in and of itself. So it doesn't mean that it's a lie. It doesn't mean that it's manufactured, but it is like those indigenous people's movement, resistance movement, movements to sustain themselves as groups who have rights to that land. In the Armenian case too, or even in the Greek case or Assyrian case in Turkey, people simply try to produce as much as possible to have evidence for the right time when the Turkish state will officially acknowledge and then pay the consequences. But it's not just the state. There are a lot of other actors in Turkey, right, which really matters for our purpose. Civil society organization, the liberal Turkish public, let's say, which they themselves have been changing their minds a lot in the last, like when I first came to the United States in 2002, I went to NYU, very, very liberal place, but when I met with and I am ethnically Armenian from Turkey, and I can totally pass as Turkish everything. I can speak Turkish. When I remember meeting with new Turkish people at NYU, and I wasn't sure if I could talk about the genocide as such, because I wouldn't be sure about what they think about this. While right now, the same, more or less, because they're coming from Turkey, the same group of like elite Turkish students, when I meet them, here at MIT very recently, once again I encountered, they would be open, like I would not have that hesitation anymore, right? The change has political, economic, different reasons, but one of the actors that enabled this change towards the right direction is the history itself, both the discipline and the actors producing history one way or another. So right now at MIT, Armenian Students Association actually is doing an exhibition, for instance, to commemorate the Armenian Genocide. And I've heard that yesterday, the president of the Turkish Students Association came and asked questions about the Armenian Genocide and wanted to learn more. Like, this would have been unthinkable only in 10 years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I would like to think that historians have something that played, they played a role in this transformation.
Yes. Greg?
I think that there are lots of examples that you can offer. I'll offer one from the last comment I made because I didn't finish it. I forgot to close the story. When African Americans reached out to Daniel O'Connell in Ireland, right, this sort of powerful Irish statesman, what O'Connell ends up doing is he sends a letter to the Americas, to the United States, but to the Irish living in the United States. And he calls on them to acknowledge and affirm their own revolutionary history, their own history of struggle for self-determination, their own history of struggle against colonialism and against imperialism, and side with African Americans in the great historic struggle against slavery. And it's an extraordinary document both because of what it attempts, the intervention it attempts to make in pre-Civil War politics, but it's also an extraordinary document precisely because it's rooted in claims to the past, and how we should come to understand that past and how that past should actually inform our moral decision-making. It's calling upon the Irish at a very difficult time in United States history to think beyond the immediate economic and political challenges of their lives and into a more global and humane space. And I think you can follow that kind of logic through lots of moments in American history. And when we first saw the question, I actually thought of the Brown decision, that there is no, there are few more transformative court decisions in American history, and there are few court decisions.
Board of Education.
Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. And there are few court decisions that are more intimately informed by a construction of history and the sociology of injustice than that one is. And in many ways, in fact, it's a demonstration of how history has to actually bring us to moments of kind of moral and social reckoning that are transformative. We can't get to those moments without the past.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about that is that history kind of plays two roles. On the one hand, history doesn't look good in that, right? But it's being both indicted and employed for change. So it's an interesting kind of paradox, as you all have all described.
And you can see it also in the struggles of First Nations, Native American nations in the United States and Canada, around the very same sets of issues when it comes to educational access, a very different history, a history of forcible, almost educational incarceration for the purpose of basically cultural cleansing, which now, in fact, actually has also returned to the courts and is informing, in fact, movements for a different kind of restorative justice.
So I think we've had a lot to chew on, and I want to open it up to questions from the audience. We've got 2 mics there, and so I encourage folks to go. I'm sure there's going to be a first mover. Oh, man with baby. Is the baby going to talk or just you, Michelle?
Maybe sleeping.
It's my question. So I feel very inspired by all I've heard about African Americans, about Turkey, Armenia, Mexico, Haiti. But I'd like to get a sense of, for us here at MIT, so given what we've learned about the history, what the students have researched, and so how can we use that in very concrete ways? Not operations per se, but how can we make MIT better, given things that we know are still happening at MIT in terms of how minorities are viewed and how treated and lack of representation? So concretely, how can we use those lessons from the past to make things better? And I can get more concrete, but let's start more generally, if you can.
Thank you. Panelists?
I guess that's me. I think when my co-teacher in the MIT and slavery course, when Nora Murphy, our archivist, when her research found that William Barton Rogers, MIT's founder, established definitively that he was a slaveholder, that conclusion, right, was not an accusation.
Right.
It's just a historical fact. And then the question is, what do we do with that historical fact? What does it challenge us to do? And my hope is that it challenges us to do more of this, right? More self-reflection, more really thinking about not just the past, but the kind of institution that we want to be. And using, in fact, an evolving history, a history that we're starting to learn more about, and that's starting to become more complicated. Once we add in the story of American slavery, and once we put MIT into the context of 19th century America with all of its complications, right? My hope is that it will lead us to really have conversations about what kind of institution we want to be in the 21st century. And how do we actually make real the things that we actually claim as central to our vision of ourselves. And so how do we act as an institution that helps to, for instance, democratize education, given our elite status and given, in fact, our somewhat complicated role in higher education? How do we actually live out, or how do we create really democratic spaces on our campus? How do we actually engage in acts of really concrete restorative justice when it comes to our own past? How do we memorialize that history with slavery, and how do we recognize it? But if we stopped at the story of slavery and MIT, I would be greatly disappointed in the project. I think what the story of slavery and MIT should get us to think about is our history with Native Americans, our history with, with gender, we've got lots of work to do. And I hope, in fact, that every time we turn to the past, with the purpose, with a sense, that it inspires us and it challenges us to create, in fact, a more democratic and inclusive future.
I guess I would add to that, so one of the things that historians do is interrogate and analyze how systems of power are constructed. State power, corporate power, racist power, and what role different institutions play in that. So if we're talking about the present, I would hope that the same questions we ask about the past in terms of how that power and oppressive systems are constructed and how they work and what the intricacies of them are, that we talk about that, or we interrogate and we ask those difficult questions about the present. So I think we would want to examine MIT's role in different structures of current oppressions, the systems of oppressions, and a million in terms of its creation of technology. I think it's been said a million times that that technological innovation or creation is not apolitical or devoid of social political consequences, right? So technologies of war, surveillance, what we're doing to the environment, who MIT partners with, corporate or governments of other countries, and looking at the practices they do. What is this web of power in which MIT as an elite institution is currently a part of, and what does that impel us to do if we understand and can see so clearly that what role that was in the past, can we apply and question it and think about it and change it and have conversations about it in the present?
Any others want to?
What she said.
I guess I'll just add something, just to emphasize that this is a very important point, that the fast, we cannot end it there to a certain extent, both in terms of concrete actions that we take, say, exhibitions, artwork, statues or changing the self-narrative, historical self-narrative of what MIT is. This is like one group of things that can be in response to whatever this project at the end will find and the kind of local global connections that it will highlight. But at the same time, what is the purpose of doing this history really? I would think that to make I don't know if we can use the term victim here, but that the descendants of people who have been disadvantaged because of how we came to be at MIT. If they are amongst us, one of the goals of this project should be to make them feel better here, right? This was, I think, part of restorative justice, right? If we end up thinking this way, the logical conclusion is that the consequences of this difficult past has a consequence for particular groups of people, and it's our responsibility. It's nothing. I also don't think that we should romanticize this idea of we are facing our history, we are good, we are better than. We should have done this before. We are correcting ourselves as we go on. But it also means that we take these things seriously. There were wrong things. What are we doing wrong at this point that will be judged as wrong in the future? This consciousness of how we will look
And that current
in the
people
future.
are already judging as wrong. So they're
Exactly,
looking at
yeah.
the resistance of those who are protesting right now.
Yes. I mean, one thing that was in the faculty newsletter very recently was obviously the Saudi Crown Prince's visit to MIT, for instance. Aren't these in conversation with each other?
I was just going to respond to the fact about William Barton Rogers, though the conversation moved on, and this might seem counter to what was said, but I do not mean it so. I thought that one response to that fact would to warn us about hagiography and the focus on great men. That's all I wanted to say. Focus on systems and processes and we haven't given up the great man myth yet, despite all your hard work.
Well, and I think I hope that one of the consequences of universities doing these kinds of projects, and there are now dozens of universities doing university and slavery, individual university and slavery projects, is I hope that one of the consequences is the sense of belonging at those institutions changes. Exactly. The sense of ownership at those institutions changes, and that we're redistributing, in fact, reshuffling how people actually engage with those institutions by starting to at least break down some of those narratives.
I think you're absolutely right, but we belong better when we don't put crowns on some of the people.
I'm with you. I'm a Republican.
I agree.
Small r. Small r.
I think, I agree with Susan on the great man theory of history, but I think, until you can get trade publishers to stop offering luxurious contracts to historians to write these hagiographies, it would probably help if we expanded our notion of who a great man or woman is, right? And have some, we can add some people to the mix in the meantime, and go about the longer term process of deconstructing this great man notion as time goes on.
My name is Zoltan Tree. I'm a first year grad student in CMS in Chas. I first off want to thank all of you, especially Dean Nobles, for moderating this, and all you panelists. I actually just wrapped up a 1-month protest against institutionalized racism that I've seen in my department as a lower income Black student. And so it was a sort of data protest, looking at the ways in which we use data and sort of hide things in data. For example, here we don't separate Black from like Afro-Caribbean or African, and then we don't connect our class data in terms of finances, like in the financial aid office, to that race data. So then the experience that I had here, and I've worked, to preface, I worked at the University of Michigan for the last, for 8 years in sort of admissions and diversity, and then came here and then saw like, in being in the media lab building, like I'm the only, or one of the only lower income Black people there. And no one sort of notices it because it's sort of hidden. There are other Black faces in the room, but then when you start to parse it out in terms of what backgrounds they're coming from, that's not something that's seen. And then when you try to articulate it, there's rarely enough space to even have the conversation to go into the nuance because people feel like you're splitting hairs, et cetera, et cetera. So that was sort of the basis of the protest. But in terms of my questions, and I sort of, it wrapped up because I felt like I was being supported, or people came out of the woodwork to support me, and we came up with a plan of action. So I'll probably talk to you later about that. But in terms of I have 2 questions. So one is similar to that. What role is data and new technology playing in not just this particular study, but in history in general? We're doing, one of the people in my VR class is doing a project where they're using augmented reality to bring archives to life. And so I wondered if you guys could all speak about the role of new technology, especially as like more and more archives are becoming digital. Are you able to find, how much of the original MIT endowment came from slave money based on, sort of new data systems, et cetera? So that's question 1. And then question 2 is similar to something Professor Lerna was saying about consequences of a difficult past and like what are we doing wrong currently. And so one of the things for me I feel like I experience here is we all hold business the same way, right? And so I made this statement where I was like, it wasn't just our bodies and our land that were colonized, and half of my family is Native American on my mom's side. But our business practices were, right? Our community circles were. So if I'm expected as a student at MIT to give a dissertation, to do et cetera, and present my information, like why do I have to do it in the same way that is connected to the form of my oppressors? Like they wrote executive summaries for slave ships, right? So how do we, in an academic context, start to expand the way that we look at information, the way we look at our work, so that we can actually include and acknowledge some of those things that were lost through colonization and slavery?
Okay, folks.
I'll do the data one first. For the class, this matters, but I think it's actually much bigger than the class. There's a kind of technical revolution happening in the humanities, and it's been happening for, 30 years, probably? Yeah. Easily for 30 years. And so the digitization of resources, the massive mapping projects that are now happening, the creation of sort of massive databases with like some of the earlier models being the one like the slave trade database, which sort of revolutionized the way that we do 18th century, 17th century history. Those are actually transforming the landscape completely and making possible projects that were not possible 20 years ago. I know my own research has been advanced significantly by those kinds of transformations. And so they matter in the context of the class, but I don't think it's specific to the class. I think the field is simply changing and changing rapidly.
And the second question, so I guess I can take a stab at that. So there are two answers. One would be, at least for while you're here, you may think about just doing what you need to do, but recognizing that you would want at some point to be able to do things differently. So I guess it's a matter of just thinking about it in a strategic way, which I'm sure you strike me as a quite strategic thinker. So I would think that that would likely be the way to go. So I'm gonna I hesitate to speak in certain ways being dean, right? I wouldn't want to be seen as getting out of my lane. So you have your department and such. But that would be my advice, right? That you want to create, obviously, you're someone who wants to create an intellectual future that is deeply engaging for you and that makes sense for you. I perfectly get that. So there's a way, I think, to do that in academia where you both do kind of, do what's required and then also think about when you do your own thing. And that day does come, usually graduation.
All right, and then I want to wrap up. Oh, she left. I wanted to honor Sarah Wallaton, who is one of the people in our department who was very supportive of my protest, but
good.
I think she maybe went to the back. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ehsan Massoud. I'm a science journalist and in the current cohort of Knight Fellows here at MIT. A couple of reflections, really, in the context of the work that you're doing. One is I wonder whether this scope, one way of extending the work that you're doing is to then encourage the bigger bodies, such as the national academies and the older learned journals like Nature and Science, to adopt some of the methodology that you're doing and to look in their own institutions, because I suspect that some of that probably isn't happening. And I think there's some publications in my own sort of world, like National Geographic, are beginning to take that step. I know there's been lots of discussions inside of Nature, because quite a bit of what they've published, particularly in from their founding years, from the mid to late 1800s, has probably been of quite dubious / questionable provenance. I think the other possible implication, and this is maybe a bigger project, but these things often work in longer timescales, is to think about how we learn and how we teach science and engineering to our young people. And when I learned my mathematics or my physics, I learned that algebra comes from Arabic-speaking countries, and then it sort of got translated, and then it got transmitted. The broader context, which was that when it didn't just come out of the Arab world from nowhere, it perhaps very likely came from India, and there was a development, but there was an appropriation of people's knowledge, and and then it moved on, and then there was another appropriation of knowledge, and then it moved on again. And that sort of, it would probably require a more co-teaching approach where, the mathematician or the physicist teaches alongside a historian. But I think there's some really, the work that you're bringing out lends itself to some of those more interesting experiments in pedagogy. Thank you.
Thank you. You all answer this?
Well, I will just say one thing. I think that second point is particularly dead on. And to give our colleagues some credit, in the STS program in Science Technology Society, we actually do have faculty who are doing exactly that kind of work and bridging the distance between the various science fields and technical fields and their own social histories. And so, David Kaiser and others who have done really quite important work in sort of providing the social history of the sciences, and both in the classroom and as scholars. But I agree with you. I think it's an important next step for us.
And in fact, at the initial announcement of the initial findings back in February, one of the students, Alicia Alexander, pretty much issued a call to all of us to go back to our labs, our classrooms, and the like, and think about the ways in which our history, our disciplines we would think about them differently, approach them differently, understand them differently if we took seriously the connections between the origins, right? As you described, whether it be Arabs and algebra or the like, just introducing race into the conversation in a way that is not orthogonal, it's like central to it, and taking that seriously. And I think that's some of what the students saw, right? That they saw the benefit of taking this class and how it was helping them rethink what they thought about engineering and science. That would be, in a certain ways, ideal in one basic way, that is keeping this history not only alive, but making it a part of MIT, right? And helping us rethink these disciplines. And in the students, you can imagine, right, if we started thinking more about people of color, women, all who have been involved not only as engineers, but helping to create that knowledge, the students who are in those classes will be empowered in some kind of ways. There are all kinds of ways in which, when those lessons aren't taught, I know as a student, I'm being political science, I know what it's like when you can't find any mirrors, and no one seems to know what your contribution are or and your capabilities are. So it seems to me there's a lot that goes into this, that this class, these efforts can do that are quite outside of your normal way of dealing with the past. If we think creatively about it here at MIT, I think we can do a lot. And my hope is that what you're suggesting and what Craig described is some part of this effort.
Hello. There are many examples of individuals, but more importantly, networks of individuals and institutions and states seeking to better the world and better humanity. In particular, like in the last century, it's been the American state with its calls for bringing democracy to the world and bringing freedom and liberalism. But not just the state, foundations, think tanks, and institutions like MIT. But this view of making the world a better place seems to be one where, like, we have this ideology or these mixtures of ideologies. In the American example, it's primarily a very, an economically liberal one, and the what happens is like this, like, we're gonna bring our ideas and give them to you, and you will implement them and make your world better that way. And you've seen that, Chile, really all over the place. And it often has disastrous consequences, whether it be the massacres in El Salvador, or the Pinochet regime in Chile, and generally the ignoring of the actual people, of their cultures and their complexities. And MIT, fits into that. MIT, especially under President Reif, talks a lot about making the world a better place, and MIT is here to improve humanity, and it seems to follow that same sort of model. I mean, you can see it with the agreements MIT has with Saudi Arabia. I mean, in the name of making the world a better place, which means liberalization of, for instance, Saudi Aramco, which is what the current prince is sort of promoting. They're willing to sign these lucrative agreements and do these ceremonies and these forums and invite the prince, whilst while Saudi Arabia is dropping cluster bombs, American-made cluster bombs on Yemen. So the question is, in addition to the intellectual side of it, which is understanding what happens and understanding how MIT has had a role with slavery, for instance, or with anything else, what role does a history department have in not just making people aware of these things, but of actively pressuring the leadership of its institution to critically examine its idea of making the world a better place, and to reconsider how that's being done?
I'll take a stab at that one. Very interesting question. It raises a lot of interesting questions about MIT. I think, to start, we have to be a little careful about positioning history as sort of the evangelists for progress in the university, bringing the benefits of civilization to the barbaric sciences and technologies. Everybody has this responsibility, and you mentioned Nature and National Geographic. The American Historical Review, before John Hope Franklin published an article in the 1970s, I think, had published a grand total of one African-American historian in the course of the entire 20th century. It was Webb Du Bois, right? So, that's the flagship journal of the American Historical Association, which is supposed to bring the benefits of progress to the rest of the world. So I think, I guess the other thing I would say is that, MIT does have a gospel. It's not liberal democracy, it's innovation, right? I think, which is the one deity I think that almost all of us here kind of bow down to in some form or another. And, there's good reasons for that. If someone, on campus can invent a cure for cancer, I'll be the first in line, right, to sign up for that drug test, right? I don't have cancer, but you understand what I'm saying. So, we all have stakes in that, but it's that, innovation is embedded in all of these other factors that we are talking about, and so it's a question of how to take the good with the bad, so to speak. But I think we do have to recognize that there is a good side to this. There is a good side to being a very wealthy university that is so embedded in an economy as MIT is, extraordinarily so in my experience. It makes MIT a wealthier place, and you can do more good for more people because of that. But it's also harder then to see, I think, what the downside of it is. Because our educational values and goals are so closely tied to the Kendall Square economy in which we are embedded that it's sometimes not clear, who's in the driver's seat, the university or the economy in which it's embedded. So it's a complicated story. I think, you have some good intuitions there. Those are my responses.
I think one of the things we have to do, first of all, is challenge this rhetoric of, not challenge, interrogate and be precise about what does it mean to make the world a better place, and what are the strategies, and when we say we're making the world a better place, is that really true in terms of the consequences of what's being produced? So I think, first of all, problematizing that. I also think that understanding the history of those, or the history from below, is absolutely crucial. And if we think about what has brought progress in terms of thinking about progress as social justice, what has brought social justice to the world? It has been mobilizations from below. And when changes are done or taken on from the top, it's because of the pressure that has come from below. So if we want MIT, an institution, an elite institution, to change, the community, those below, those who make it up, have to pressure to get that change to happen, have to mobilize to make that change happen. And it has to be more than just the historians. So I thought you brought up some really compelling points that I think we should really think about and think about what our responsibility is to make change happen, and not to just think, well, those on the top and the powerful, since they have the power, they're the ones who are going to make change. And is that change that is in the interest of those in power to make? Is that in the interest of the general population or of humanity or of the masses? And one of the things I have learned from looking at history is how important social, political mobilizations from below are.
We actually had, I believe one of the questions we got from the last event was, what's the use of focusing on the past when MIT is at the task of inventing the future? And one of our colleagues in the history department, Kaylee Oren, pointed out a few days ago that there's a long history to inventing the future. Like every generation makes that claim. And between generations, we make that claim. And that history is extraordinarily troubled. And so the real purpose, when we make declarations about the future, when we make declarations about the tomorrow that we want to see, those declarations have to be informed by a really rigorous and honest engagement with the past, precisely because we're not, in fact, the first people to think we're doing good work.
Thank you. So you'll have the last question. Yes.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Danielle Wood, and I've just joined the faculty here at MIT in the Media Lab. And so I started in January, and I'm leading a research group called Space Enabled. We have the goal of applying space technology for development. And I'm thankful to be here. I'm actually so thankful that you're doing this today. And I'll show you a short commercial. Tomorrow we're hosting an event with Ibram Kendi that continues this conversation, looking at the history of racist ideas in America. So please join us and continue this discussion with us there. I want to ask something of a personal question in the sense of coping, meaning I just read Ebony and Ivy, and reading Ibram Kendi's book as well. I want to ask your advice, because I've heard a lot of optimism from the panelists, and yet we also have been acknowledging some of the struggles that we are studying, meaning some of the negative aspects of the history. And part of my goal as a teacher now is to invite my students to walk through this process, and thinking of it as a grief process for me and for the students who will study it. Mm-hmm. How do you guys recommend receiving negative information, dwelling on it, reflecting on it, grieving in a healthy way, being motivated to be an activist, but also being able to move on from the grief in a healthy way and then take action, and then repeat the cycle again? Because I hope to do it in my actual research and in my work, to continue to dwell on history when we work with communities, for example, to apply technology. We want to first respect and humbly listen to history, and then be able to act, but not be paralyzed and yet not be cocky. Mm-hmm. But I've heard that you guys have seemed to have achieved some of that in your work. Thank you.
It's not. I'll tell you, I think it's actually very, very, very hard for me to be optimistic. I try to be, or I'm optimistic. If you define optimist as a well-informed pessimist, I mean, you are really aware of how bad things have been, and actually, by many measures, how bad things are right now. How difficult, what an incredibly difficult moment it is right now. So even as I was preparing to talk about this and to talk about some of the questions, well, what are the positive things that we look, and the movements that I've studied and the repression that they've been victims of, I'm like, oh my God, what have we gained? If I'm looking back in terms of Mexico, just like, how many dead, how many incarcerated, and this, what about the situation now? And so part of me says, well, what would it look like had there not been all this protest? What would the landscape be there? So that's one of the things I'm constantly telling myself. And the other is sort of acknowledging that it's hard, and just sort of saying, yeah, but you're gonna go down fighting. Like where do you get the strength to keep going when it's such a it can seem so bleak? Well, I get it by looking at people who struggled in even bleaker past, or apparently bleaker past. So it's actually by studying those histories and those moments and the beauty of it that I find strength. And I must say, when I teach, or in my teaching, in my research, and in my writing, this is really fed by those students who engage with this history and get meaning out of them. One of them who spoke, Alonso, for example. In the research, when you write people who are thankful for rescuing or for putting forth that history, and I interact a lot with people themselves who are active in struggle right now in Mexico, or whose parents who are heirs to a difficult history, from difficult as in repression, difficult not as in like, oh, we have to deal with this fact that we're privileged because of the repression, and it really. Their energy, their vibe, their will to go on in really difficult situations is humbling to me.
I can jump. If I'm understanding your question correctly, and I'm understanding it from the perspective of how I have been going through this process of grief, mourning, shock, sadness, then the mandate to teach these things and then to come to terms in one way or another for myself, and then to pass it to my students, to my kids, all that. I think one thing that helped me is I am those African Americans who searched Irish history, to put things in comparison. In a somewhat weird way, strengthens me, both in terms of how I deal with it at an emotional level, but also analytically, it opens my mind. So, for instance, in my case, the Armenian Genocide, post-genocide, what do minorities in perpetrator states do type of questions, I looked at different examples. And I from African context to Egypt, Palestinians in Israel, Copts in Egypt, all these dimensions allowed me to really humanize the perpetrator. Because at the end, this is, and I come to this conclusion that serves me whenever I'm thinking about these things. I mean, the fact that we are grieving something that could have happened in a different way, or we could have been the perpetrators ourselves. When the right conditions are met, human groups do evil things. This is the 101 of genocide studies, right? So people did not enslave other people because they were whites, really. They did it because they were humans who had the power to do so, right? That kind of, or in the Young Turk, the Turkish example, for instance, once one of my professors told me years ago that Young Turks, the main perpetrating group, a sentence that resonated with me, the state, Young Turks were not evil people, they did evil things. They were not monsters, but they did monstrous things, actually. In Turkish, this is what he said. So the very inquiry itself in various levels really helped me. And also the fact that people receive this, the way both the students and my intellectual community, including my colleagues, in different fields have been listening to what I have to say about this also helps a lot in terms of finding meaning in what I do, which is the ultimate salvation from various different conflicting emotions.
Malick, Craig, before we conclude?
Craig, did you want to make a comment? I mean, I was just going to say, I don't think I actually modeled an answer to your question very well for my students. My students actually, I think, sometimes come up with interesting solutions. We just read about the Aaron Swartz case in my libertarianism class, and one of my students went off and wrote this, 4-page blog post responding, to all of the questions that the students had raised. I mean, it's a very kind of sad, tragic story, but it was pretty incredible, and I see that in MIT students year after year, that they're just very creative in that way. But I think if I had to point to an example of how I would want to model this, I would point to a place, rather than a person. I mean, for me, the place is Haiti, right? So a place, every time I go there, it's extremely discouraging to go there. I just took my 2 kids there for the first time last summer, and they were just kind of overwhelmed by the whole experience. I mean, really kind of distressed by it, and we're not really in a hurry to go back. they're very young. I mean, for me, it is discouraging, but it is also very encouraging to kind of see how people cope with those conditions. And, you know, sometimes it's a missionary, you know, coming in and going and, you know, doing what they can and going back. And sometimes it's just an ordinary Haitian person trying to make the best with what they have, or, you know, giving a tour of the Haitian Pantheon and showing the historical monuments to a group of visiting tourists. I mean, there's all kinds of examples, but I would just say that it's the experience of being in that particular place that, for me, is probably the best model that I have ever seen for, you know, doing what you're describing.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you all for coming. We've got a great reception outside, so it's kind of warm in here and we're hungry. But it's really been terrific. I think we've got a lot to chew on. I thank you all for coming. I thank my panelists for participating. And so giving us a lot to reflect on, and we'll continue to do so as we move forward. So thank you.